Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to Japan. Not the Japan of neon lights, bullet trains, or tidy convenience stores. No, we're going somewhere much slower. Somewhere dimly lit, perfumed with incense, and humming faintly with the sound of shamisen strings. Let's drift back to Edo, the city that later became Tokyo. The year might be 1650 or 1750, it doesn't really matter. The lamps still glow the same amber color. The streets are still narrow, and the night feels long enough to last forever. In those years, Japan had been sealed off from most of the world. The Tokugawa shoguns had decided that foreign ideas were far too inconvenient, and perhaps even contagious. So, they closed the country like one might close a sliding paper door. No Europeans allowed, except a handful of Dutch traders who were safely tucked away on a small artificial island in Nagasaki, where they couldn't cause too much trouble. Inside this carefully locked room of a country, Japanese culture began to evolve like a garden left untended, overgrown but beautiful. Edo itself was a city of contrasts. 1 million people lived there, more than in London at the time, stacked in wooden houses that could burn down at the mere sight of a candle. It was bustling and yet strangely quiet. The samurai class, technically in charge of everything, mostly spent their days broken board, living off stipends that never quite stretched far enough. Merchants, on the other hand, were becoming rich, embarrassingly rich, but officially ranked near the bottom of society. So, naturally, they looked for elegant ways to spend their money that didn't look too vulgar. And that is where our story begins. Because when money meets boredom, art tends to appear. Or at least, the performance of art. In Edo, entertainment districts were not just tolerated, they were officially designated. The government, being both moralistic and deeply practical, decided that if people were going to seek pleasure, they might as well do it in one contained area, where it could be taxed, regulated, and politely ignored. Thus was born Yoshiwara, the most famous pleasure quarter in Japanese history. Yoshiwara wasn't quite a red light district, though it's often called that now. It was more of a floating world, ukiyo, as the Japanese poets put it, a place set apart from the gray, regulated life outside. A world that floated between fantasy and reality, like a dream you weren't supposed to analyze too closely. Once you crossed the moat and passed through its gates, time seemed to move differently. You might arrive in the evening and leave days later, unsure of how many nights had passed. Inside, everything shimmered. The air smelled of sweet incense and fresh rain on tatami mats. Lanterns hung in soft rows, painting the wooden streets with pools of orange light. The courtesans, known as yujo, moved like slow comets through this glow, trailing silk, perfume, and silence. Now, before we go further, it's important to say that not every courtesan lived the same life. There were layers, many layers, within this world. The lowest-ranked women might see a dozen clients in a night, their lives measured out in candle lengths. The highest, the Taiyu or Oiran, were treated less like prostitutes and more like goddesses of art. They were trained in calligraphy, poetry, music, and conversation. They didn't simply entertain, they curated fantasy. A Taiyu's value wasn't just her beauty, it was her ability to create a complete illusion. To make her client feel like a noble poet, a warrior philosopher, or perhaps a tragic romantic hero from one of the kabuki plays that mirrored this same floating world. A Taiyu could recite waka poems from memory, paint delicate scenes of plum blossoms in winter, and quote Confucius with just enough irony to make it sound flirtatious. And naturally, all of this cost a small fortune. Let's pause here for a moment and imagine one of these women, the Oiran. Her name might have been Hana, or something more poetic like Katsuragi. She begins her day in the afternoon, because in Yoshiwara, the night is the real world and daylight is a polite inconvenience. Servants prepare her hair, an elaborate tower of lacquered black coils pinned with tortoiseshell combs and golden ornaments. Her kimono might weigh 20 pounds, layers upon layers of brocade silk, embroidered with cranes or chrysanthemums, trailing nearly a meter behind her as she walks. But she doesn't walk the way ordinary women do. She glides, slowly, deliberately, her feet turned inward. It's called the figure-eight walk, and it was designed to make her seem like she was floating just above the ground. Clients would line the streets to watch the Oiran's procession, their jaws slack with awe, or maybe exhaustion, it was hard to tell which. Her walk, her smile, her silence, all were part of the performance. To be chosen by an Oiran was not easy. A client might need to visit several times, offer expensive gifts, and endure the slow ritual of being approved. In that sense, she was not a woman for hire. She was a gatekeeper of fantasy, and one could only enter her world by invitation. That, perhaps, is the first reason the Japanese saw courtesans as artists, not prostitutes. Their world was not one of mere transaction, but of transformation. The irony, of course, is that all of this beauty existed within walls. Yoshiwara was physically enclosed by moats and gates. Once inside, courtesans couldn't simply leave. For all the talk of elegance and art, it was still a gilded cage. Many were sold into service as children, apprenticed under older women, and trained for years. Some might eventually buy their freedom, though most never did. But inside that confinement, they built a culture unlike anything else in Japan. The courtesans became arbiters of taste. Their hairstyles, speech patterns, and fashion choices rippled outward into the rest of society. Even samurai wives would copy their styles, though they would never admit it. The kabuki theater imitated their gestures. Artists painted them endlessly. The world outside wanted what the courtesans represented: sophistication, freedom, and a little bit of defiance. Let's drift for a moment into the art itself. You might have seen ukiyo-e prints, those woodblock images of elegant women with narrow eyes, pale skin, and hair piled high. Many of those were inspired by Yoshiwara courtesans. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaro and Suzuki Harunobu turned them into icons of beauty and melancholy. Even centuries later, when Western collectors discovered these prints, they mistook them for simple portraits of prostitutes. But to the Japanese eye, these were images of artistry. Women who embodied an aesthetic ideal, poised between pleasure and sadness. Now, let's drift to the idea of the floating world itself. The word ukiyo originally meant something rather gloomy, the sorrowful world, as in the Buddhist sense of suffering and impermanence. But in Edo, people twisted it, playfully. They changed the characters so that ukiyo now meant floating world, the same sound, but a different mood. It became a place where one could forget the heaviness of life, at least for a few hours. In the floating world, time was elastic. Day and night blurred. The rules of class dissolved. A lowly merchant could pretend to be a poet, a samurai could escape his duties, a courtesan could pretend to be free. It was an ecosystem of illusions, built upon performance and pretense, and yet somehow it produced genuine art. Because art often blooms in strange places. In restriction. In hypocrisy. Even in loneliness. Courtesans spent years learning how to write letters that were poetic yet polite, distant yet suggestive. Their calligraphy alone could be worth keeping. They studied music, practiced dance, memorized poems from the Menyoshu, and learned how to flatter a client without seeming submissive. Some became so respected that poets and scholars sought them out just for conversation. In short, they were trained not merely to please, but to enchant. It's easy to assume now that these women were victims, and yes, many were. But in the strange hierarchy of Yoshiwara, some rose to hold remarkable power. An Oiran could choose her clients, charge exorbitant fees, and even influence trends that spread across the nation. She could destroy a man's fortune with a single smile, and he would thank her for the privilege. There's an old saying in Edo, the courtesan rules the night, but the night rules everyone. Their artistry was performative, but it was also economic. The beauty of a kimono, the grace of a dance, the elegance of a tea ceremony, all were investments. Merchants competed not for affection but for association. To be seen in the company of a famous courtesan was to signal refinement. Think of it as 18th-century luxury branding, except instead of buying a handbag, you spent your savings on an evening of carefully choreographed perfection. And much like modern celebrities, the courtesans became names whispered across cities. Their reputations were built on layers of storytelling, half fact, half fantasy. Writers composed kiboshi comic books about them, dramatizing their heartbreaks and triumphs. Some were rumored to fall in love with their clients, though most of those stories were romantic exaggerations meant to make the customers feel important. After all, who doesn't want to believe they've stolen the heart of a living artwork? Let's drift for a moment into a more personal space, the courtesan's quarters. Imagine the small, dim room with sliding paper screens, a low table, and a faint trail of perfume. The light is soft, filtered through silk. There's a half-finished poem on the table, written in beautiful, deliberate strokes. Somewhere outside, someone laughs too loudly. The courtesan sits quietly, practicing her shamisen. The sound is delicate, like raindrops on lacquer. She might not be thinking of the man who will arrive later. She might be thinking of home, or of nothing at all. For all her outward perfection, her life is made of routines, of practiced gestures. Every smile, every sip of sake, every sigh is part of the illusion. And yet, even within that illusion, there is humanity. These women found ways to express themselves, through poetry, through fashion, through the smallest acts of individuality. In a society that often demanded silence from women, the courtesans spoke through art. It's a strange irony, isn't it? That in a patriarchal world, the only women who could express themselves freely were those who lived within walls. As night deepens in Yoshiwara, the streets grow quieter. Lanterns flicker, music fades. Somewhere, a client dozes off mid-conversation. The courtesans retreat to their rooms, removing the layers of brocade and combs. Their hair, freed from lacquer, falls like black silk. The illusion dissolves until morning, when it will be rebuilt again. You can almost hear the rain tapping on the paper walls. And as it does, you might start to understand why these women were called artists. Their lives were performances of grace, tragedy, and resilience. They lived in a world that treated them as ornaments but couldn't function without their artistry. So the next time someone reduces them to a single word, prostitute, remember the layers of silk, the poems, the dances, the calligraphy, the laughter, and the quiet ache of beauty that could never last. Because in Edo, art wasn't something hung on a wall. It was something lived, one night at a time. Let's drift onward, next time, into how Yoshiwara's courtesans shaped Japan's literature and visual art, and how their influence lingered even after the district's lights went out. But before you close your eyes, tell me something in the comments. If you had lived in Edo, do you think you would have visited Yoshiwara, or tried to stay far, far away? Let's ease back into the amber light of Edo. The rain from last night still lingers, leaving the streets slick and glistening. Paper lanterns sway gently, their reflections quivering in the puddles. Somewhere, the faint strumming of a shamisen echoes through the narrow wooden alleys. The night is gone, but its music seems to linger, half memory, half mist. The courtesans are sleeping now, or pretending to. Their painted faces have been washed away, the layers of silk folded neatly in the corner. The air smells faintly of incense and camellia oil. And outside the walls of Yoshiwara, the rest of Edo stirs awake, ready for another day of pretending everything is perfectly moral. You might think of art as something that comes from freedom, from choice. But in Edo, it was often born from limitation, from having no choice at all. The courtesans of Yoshiwara, for all their elegance, lived under tight rules. They were both idolized and imprisoned. But their image, controlled, rehearsed, perfected, became one of the most powerful symbols of Japanese aesthetics. The artists who painted them were mostly men. Men who visited Yoshiwara with sketchbooks tucked into their sleeves, pretending to be there purely for inspiration. They sat quietly in the corner of tea-houses, sipping sake and pretending not to look too closely. Then, back in their workshops, they carved the faces of the courtesans into woodblocks, layer by layer. This was the birth of ukiyo-e, the pictures of the floating world. The woodblock prints we now see framed in museums, delicate and serene, were once popular culture. Sold cheaply, stacked in stalls, folded into letters, even used to wrap small packages. It's oddly poetic that what we now consider fine art was, at the time, more like celebrity posters. Because that's what many ukiyo-e prints were, portraits of stars. The courtesans of Yoshiwara were the celebrities of their age. The Oiran were the supermodels. The kabuki actors were the movie stars. Poets, musicians, and dancers all mingled in the same glowing night, feeding off one another's art and performance. The result was a cultural explosion wrapped in silk and sake. Let's linger on one of the most famous artists of that era, Kitagawa Utamaro. Utamaro specialized in portraits of women, specifically courtesans and geisha. His style was intimate, almost tender. He captured small gestures, a woman adjusting her hairpin, writing a letter, or gazing out a window with the faintest, most unreadable smile. These weren't moralizing depictions. They were studies in mood, in grace, in transience. And yet, there was always an undercurrent of irony. The same society that celebrated these images also condemned the women in them. People collected prints of courtesans while pretending that visiting Yoshiwara was scandalous. Hypocrisy has a way of aging well. It looks remarkably similar across centuries. Utamoro's works were so beloved that they spread far beyond Japan's shores. When Japan reopened to the West in the mid-19th century, European artists like Degas and Van Gogh discovered ukiyo-e and were transfixed. They called it Japanism, a trend that would influence Impressionism, interior design, even fashion. The soft lines, the flat colors, the empty space, all drawn from the floating world. It's rather poetic, isn't it? The images of women's society once confined became the face of a global art movement. And the women themselves, well, they were long gone by then, their names forgotten, but their likenesses were everywhere. Immortalized not as sinners, but as muses. Let's drift back into the courtesan's daily world. The beauty you see in ukiyo-e wasn't spontaneous, it was carefully cultivated. The Oiran and their apprentices followed routines that would make modern influencers look lazy. They rehearsed their expressions, their posture, their manner of speaking. Every gesture meant something. The tilt of the head, the turn of a fan, even how long they held a guest's gaze, it was all trained, practiced, and perfected. A courtesan's face was, in itself, a kind of mask, painted not to conceal, but to reveal the illusion. White makeup softened under candlelight. Red lips appeared almost black in the dim glow. The effect was ghostly, yet mesmerizing. It wasn't designed to look natural. It was meant to look eternal. That aesthetic, of beauty as performance, would shape Japan for centuries. Even today, the minimalist grace of Japanese art and fashion carries traces of that old Yoshiwara ideal. Controlled emotion. Quiet allure. The art of suggestion rather than declaration. But there was always melancholy beneath it. Every courtesan knew that her beauty was temporary, that her name might fade before her face did. It was that awareness, of impermanence, that made the art of the floating world so haunting. And perhaps that's why the Japanese, more than most cultures, learned to find beauty in sadness. There's a phrase you hear often in Japanese aesthetics, mono no aware. It means the gentle sadness of things. The awareness that everything, no matter how beautiful, will eventually fade. The courtesans embodied that concept perfectly. Their world was built on impermanence. A night of laughter would vanish by morning. A love letter would be burned. A poem might be recited once and never again. Everything was temporary, and therefore precious. Artists painted them knowing this. Poets wrote about them in the same tone one uses for autumn leaves. The beauty of the floating world was inseparable from its ephemerality. It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about the quiet ache of knowing it couldn't last. Utamaro once said, at least he said to have said, that the line between sorrow and beauty is a hair's breadth. In Yoshiwara, that line was painted on every woman's face. Now, let's step beyond Yoshiwara's gates for a moment. Outside, Edo society tried its best to look respectable. The samurai talked about honor, the merchants about modesty, the priests about virtue. But everyone knew where the real culture was being born. The art, the fashion, the music, all of it came from the floating world. Merchants copied the courtesans' hairstyles. Poets mimicked their language. Even kabuki actors, many of whom were men playing women, borrowed their movements. The women of Yoshiwara shaped how Japan saw femininity itself. Imagine that, a group of women officially considered fallen, creating the very image of refinement. It's one of history's small jokes, delivered quietly, like a smirk behind a fan. But beauty, of course, has its politics. The shogunate was deeply uneasy about Yoshiwara's influence. Pleasure was one thing, but influence, that was dangerous. So the government tried, in its bureaucratic way, to control it. Edicts were issued limiting the extravagance of clothing and hairstyles. Officials declared that courtesans could only wear certain colors, or that their hairpins must not exceed a certain number. Naturally, this only made things worse. The courtesans responded by doubling down on their style. If they couldn't use gold hairpins, they used silver ones, twice as many. If bright silk was forbidden, they used subtler tones with more expensive embroidery. Restriction became innovation. And so, through every attempt to regulate them, the courtesans became even more fashionable. The government wanted modesty. They created masterpieces. Because of course they did. Let's drift into one of those ukiyo-e workshops, just for a moment. A carver sits cross-legged on the floor, his hands moving steadily as he cuts delicate lines into a block of cherry wood. Each color will require a separate block, each one carefully aligned. The printer will later layer them, one over another, until the courtesan's image emerges, like a ghost taking form. This process, slow and exact, mirrors the courtesan's own art. Both are exercises in patience and illusion. Both turn impermanence into beauty. The carver knows that his print will fade, that the colors will yellow over time. But that's fine. In Japan, impermanence isn't failure, it's the point. As the carver works, he hums a song from the theater. It's one the courtesans like, something about a love that only lasts until dawn. Some courtesans became legends. There was Takao, said to be so beautiful that even samurai trembled when she spoke. She was courted by the famous warrior date Tsunemon, who supposedly offered her a fortune to love him. She refused, politely, several times. In some versions of the story, he killed her in rage. In others, she died of illness, still young. Either way, she became a symbol of tragic beauty, a Japanese Ophelia, immortalized in plays and paintings. Another, Yujiri, was known for her poetry. She wrote verses so melancholic that men wept, though perhaps they were also just drunk. One of her lines survives, "In the shallow river of dreams, I wait for the moon that will not rise." It's the kind of sadness that lingers, soft and low, like the echo of a flute. Their names became myths. But behind each myth was a woman who probably just wanted to rest, to stop performing for a while. When we think of courtesans today, we tend to flatten their lives into tragedy. But in Edo, they were also creators. The floating world was their stage, their studio, and their trap, all at once. They defined beauty for an entire civilization, yet they were denied the right to live freely within it. They created art that men signed and sold. They inspired fashion that they themselves could never wear outside the walls. It's the kind of irony history specializes in, beautiful, infuriating, and utterly human. And yet, through that narrow space between control and expression, they built something lasting. Their gestures became brushstrokes. Their songs became poems. Their faces became icons. Even now, when you see an image of a geisha or an Edo beauty, her head tilted slightly, her lips painted red, her eyes lowered, you're seeing an echo of Yoshiwara. A whisper of that world that floated between sin and art, desire and restraint. As night falls again, the lanterns return to life. Another evening begins. The courtesans rise, transform once more into living artworks, and glide into the glowing streets. The rain has stopped. The air smells of smoke and plum blossoms. Somewhere, a poet sighs, realizing he can never quite capture what he sees. The floating world continues, half dream, half reflection. And even though centuries have passed, the echoes of its art still ripple quietly through everything that came after. Because beauty, once born, never truly dies. It just changes its disguise. And now, before we drift onward to our next chapter, into the courtesans' hidden education, their secret codes of etiquette, and the quiet rebellion beneath their refinement, tell me in the comments. If you lived in Edo and had one chance to spend an evening in Yoshiwara, what kind of art would you want to see? The music, the dance, or the illusion of love itself? Let's drift back into that half-lit world once more. The lanterns of Yoshiwara flicker softly against the pale dawn, and the scent of night lingers in the tatami. The air feels heavy with perfume and memory. Somewhere, a paper fan lies folded beside an empty sake cup, a faint lipstick mark still visible on the rim. The revelers are gone now, and what remains is silence, that peculiar expectant silence that comes after music. Behind the scenes, Yoshiwara is waking again. Servants sweep the narrow streets. A shopkeeper hangs his Norin curtain over the door. A hairdresser stretches her fingers, ready for another long day of arranging impossible hairstyles. And in the back rooms of the brothels, or houses, as they prefer to call them, the apprentices rise, quietly, to begin their lessons. Because in the floating world, artistry didn't happen by accident. It was taught, rehearsed, repeated. Every Oiran, every Taiyu, every so-called woman of pleasure, was first and foremost a student. Training began early. A girl might be sold or apprenticed into a house at the age of 10 or 11, sometimes younger. Her parents, often poor farmers or small-town merchants, might be told that she was being sent to learn the arts. And in a strange, bittersweet way, that wasn't entirely false. She'd arrive in Yoshiwara carrying little more than a small bundle of clothes and a nervous curiosity about what lay behind the walls. The madam of the house, the Okami, would size her up like a merchant inspecting silk. If she showed promise, graceful posture, clear skin, a quick wit, she might be trained for years as a shinzo, an attendant to a senior courtesan. From that moment on, her world would shrink to the width of the corridors inside that house. Morning lessons began with posture. How to kneel correctly. How to walk with a kimono so heavy it seemed designed for punishment. How to bow, not too deep, not too shallow, and always with perfect timing. Then came the harder lessons, speech, music, and etiquette. She learned the precise art of conversation, the rhythm of deference, the melody of wit. She practiced reciting verses from the Kokinshu and tales of Genji, even if she didn't yet understand their subtler meanings. She studied the koto and shamisen, instruments that required both dexterity and restraint. Every note was meant to feel effortless, even when her fingers burned. There were calligraphy lessons too, because a courtesan's handwriting could be as seductive as her smile. Clients treasured their letters, sometimes framing them like art. Each brushstroke carried a message, graceful curves for flirtation, sharp angles for distance. And above all, she was taught to observe. To sense a man's mood before he spoke. To know when to laugh, when to listen, and when silence itself would be the most flattering response. The idea was simple. A courtesan's power came not from what she gave, but from what she withheld. She learned the art of that subtle, unspoken connection, the feeling of intimacy suspended just out of reach. She was never to be too eager, never too distant. Her appeal lay in balance, in the perfect poise between warmth and restraint. By the time a girl reached her mid-teens, she might finally be ready to debut as a Kamuro, a young attendant to a senior courtesan. She'd follow her mentor everywhere, carrying her fan, helping her change, memorizing every gesture. It was like watching a play every day of your life, and eventually realizing you're meant to become the lead actor. And when that day finally came, when she became a courtesan herself, she'd already have spent half her life preparing for it. It's an odd thing, isn't it? The world outside saw only the glamour, the silk, the jewels, the candlelight. But behind it was discipline. Years of it. Every flutter of the sleeve, every sigh, every glance across a sake cup was a product of study. You could say the courtesan's real art wasn't seduction, it was self-control. Now, we might pause here and wonder why all this effort went into a profession society claimed to despise. The answer lies in contradiction. Edo Japan was built on them. The samurai were warriors forbidden to fight. The merchants were rich but looked down upon. And the courtesans, women officially labeled as shameful, became the ultimate standard of grace. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, they created a parallel world where beauty was currency and art was survival. Their education was not just performance, it was a shield. A courtesan's intelligence and refinement allowed her to exist among men who otherwise would have dismissed her. Some historians even call Yoshiwara the first school of female independence in Japan, albeit one built on tragic foundations. Because here, a woman could learn skills that were forbidden to most others. Literacy, music, debate, even philosophy. She could talk politics with a samurai or critique poetry with a scholar, something that would have been unthinkable for an ordinary wife. It was a strange kind of empowerment, the sort that existed only inside the cage. Let's imagine a scene from one of these lessons. A small room. Tatami mats freshly brushed. In the corner, a brazier glows faintly. A senior courtesan sits beside a young apprentice, demonstrating how to pour tea without spilling a drop, how to fold a napkin with elegance, how to smile just enough to seem genuine but not enough to invite presumption. The girl imitates her, fumbling slightly. The older woman sighs, not unkindly, and adjusts the girl's hand. "No," she says softly. "Not like that. Let the movement breathe." There's wisdom in that sentence, though the girl doesn't yet know it. Let the movement breathe. It means, don't rush beauty. Don't chase attention. Let stillness do the work. That small piece of advice, whispered across centuries, feels like a key to Japanese art itself. Beyond manners and art, the courtesans also learned something more subtle: how to read power. Yoshiwara was a microcosm of politics. Samurai, merchants, and artists all gathered there, pretending to be equals for one night. The courtesans moved among them with practiced neutrality. They listened more than they spoke, gathering information the way a poet gathers metaphors. Some became confidants to powerful men. Others used their influence to help artists or friends. A few even shaped local politics in quiet ways, though their names were rarely recorded. It's said that one Oiran once saved an artist from imprisonment by slipping his name into a poem she recited for a visiting magistrate. The official was so flattered by her verse that he let the artist go. Whether that story is true or not hardly matters. It feels true enough for Yoshiwara. Because here, wit was currency. A single clever word could buy more than gold. But education also came with its darker lessons. An apprentice was taught early that affection was dangerous. That love was to be performed, not felt. A courtesan who fell in love, truly, disastrously in love, risked everything. Some did, of course. There are stories of Oiran who fled Yoshiwara with lovers, only to be captured and punished. Others took their own lives in melodramatic acts of devotion that poets would later romanticize. Yet behind those tales lies a quieter truth. Most courtesans learned to separate emotion from performance. Not out of cynicism, but survival. Their art required empathy, but not attachment. Like actors who cry on stage without shedding a single tear after the curtain falls. And perhaps that, too, was part of their artistry, the ability to make emotion seem infinite, while keeping it contained within the bounds of a single evening. Every few years, the apprentices and courtesans would attend a festival within Yoshiwara, a kind of ceremonial display where the highest-ranking women paraded through the streets. It wasn't just for show, it was a ritual of identity. The courtesans presented themselves as artists, walking sculptures of silk and etiquette. Their debut was the culmination of all those lessons: posture, voice, poetry, dance. The moment when practice and performance finally became one. And as they glided through the crowd, faces painted and expression serene, you could almost forget that this was a profession built on exploitation. For a few hours, they seemed untouchable. The embodiment of refinement. The illusion made flesh. Art can be cruel that way. It asks for devotion without mercy. One might wonder what these women thought of themselves. Did they believe they were artists? Did they see their world as beautiful, or simply bearable? There are fragments of diaries and letters that suggest both. Some write with pride, proud of their education, their composure, their fame. Others express quiet bitterness. "We are blossoms that bloom in the dark," one wrote, "and fall before morning." Another said, "If I could be born again, I would like to sell poems instead of smiles." And yet, within their confined world, they continued to learn, to refine, to teach others. The artistry was passed down like a secret, not through schools or books, but through gestures, glances, and whispered advice. A lineage of grace, carried through centuries by women who could never claim it openly. Outside Yoshiwara's walls, education for women was rare. Most girls learned little beyond household tasks. Reading and writing were luxuries. But inside Yoshiwara, ironically, the courtesans were among the most educated women in Japan. It's one of those contradictions history loves. The idea that the most cultured women in the country were the ones society refused to acknowledge. Their learning, though confined, left ripples. Some of their poetry survived. Their speech influenced the way the educated classes wrote love letters. Their sense of beauty became the standard in painting, theater, and even garden design. You could say that while men built the temples, women built the mood. It means, don't rush beauty. Don't chase attention. Let stillness do the work. That small piece of advice, whispered across centuries, feels like a key to Japanese art itself. Beyond manners and art, the courtesans also learned something more subtle: how to read power. Yoshiwara was a microcosm of politics. Samurai, merchants, and artists all gathered there, pretending to be equals for one night. The courtesans moved among them with practiced neutrality. They listened more than they spoke, gathering information the way a poet gathers metaphors. Some became confidants to powerful men. Others used their influence to help artists or friends. A few even shaped local politics in quiet ways, though their names were rarely recorded. It's said that one Oiran once saved an artist from imprisonment by slipping his name into a poem she recited for a visiting magistrate. The official was so flattered by her verse that he let the artist go. Whether that story is true or not hardly matters. It feels true enough for Yoshiwara. Because here, wit was currency. A single clever word could buy more than gold. But education also came with its darker lessons. An apprentice was taught early that affection was dangerous. That love was to be performed, not felt. A courtesan who fell in love, truly, disastrously in love, risked everything. Some did, of course. There are stories of Oiran who fled Yoshiwara with lovers, only to be captured and punished. Others took their own lives in melodramatic acts of devotion that poets would later romanticize. Yet behind those tales lies a quieter truth. Most courtesans learned to separate emotion from performance. Not out of cynicism, but survival. Their art required empathy, but not attachment. Like actors who cry on stage without shedding a single tear after the curtain falls. And perhaps that, too, was part of their artistry, the ability to make emotion seem infinite, while keeping it contained within the bounds of a single evening. Every few years, the apprentices and courtesans would attend a festival within Yoshiwara, a kind of ceremonial display where the highest-ranking women paraded through the streets. It wasn't just for show, it was a ritual of identity. The courtesans presented themselves as artists, walking sculptures of silk and etiquette. Their debut was the culmination of all those lessons: posture, voice, poetry, dance. The moment when practice and performance finally became one. And as they glided through the crowd, faces painted and expression serene, you could almost forget that this was a profession built on exploitation. For a few hours, they seemed untouchable. The embodiment of refinement. The illusion made flesh. Art can be cruel that way. It asks for devotion without mercy. One might wonder what these women thought of themselves. Did they believe they were artists? Did they see their world as beautiful, or simply bearable? There are fragments of diaries and letters that suggest both. Some write with pride, proud of their education, their composure, their fame. Others express quiet bitterness. "We are blossoms that bloom in the dark," one wrote, "and fall before morning." Another said, "If I could be born again, I would like to sell poems instead of smiles." And yet, within their confined world, they continued to learn, to refine, to teach others. The artistry was passed down like a secret, not through schools or books, but through gestures, glances, and whispered advice. A lineage of grace, carried through centuries by women who could never claim it openly. Outside Yoshiwara's walls, education for women was rare. Most girls learned little beyond household tasks. Reading and writing were luxuries. But inside Yoshiwara, ironically, the courtesans were among the most educated women in Japan. It's one of those contradictions history loves, the idea that the most cultured women in the country were the ones society refused to acknowledge. Their learning, though confined, left ripples. Some of their poetry survived. Their speech influenced the way the educated classes wrote love letters. Their sense of beauty became the standard in painting, theater, and even garden design. You could say that while men built the temples, women built the mood. Listen carefully. You can almost hear the faint pluck of a shamisen string beneath the sound of rain. Somewhere deep inside Yoshiwara, the night is preparing to begin again. Lanterns bloom to life one by one. The streets glow in streaks of amber and gold. Perfume seeps from open doorways, sweet and heavy, like a memory refusing to fade. Every corner hums with ritual. Courtesans slip into silk robes layered like petals. Servants rush with trays of lacquered dishes. Poets rehearse verses in their heads, hoping to impress. And amid this soft frenzy, the courtesan transforms once more. Not into a woman. Into an illusion. For her, beauty was not decoration, it was a performance, a discipline. Every fold of fabric, every stroke of makeup, every step she took was part of a choreography older than herself. To see an Oiran ready herself was to watch a ritual that bordered on sacred. It could take hours. Her attendants brushed her hair until it gleamed like lacquer, winding it into complex shapes, towers of loops and combs pinned with tortoiseshell, coral, or gold. A single hairstyle might take 20 pins, each placed according to rank and status. Then came the kimono, layers upon layers of silk, each one a story. Patterns of cranes, waves, plum blossoms, and distant mountains. Colors that shifted with season and occasion. The weight could exceed 20 kilograms. But when she walked, you would swear she floated. Over her obi, the great sash tied in front, not back, attendants would tie intricate knots, unique to each house. The placement alone told connoisseurs who she was. In Yoshiwara, fashion spoke like poetry. And then, the final touch, her makeup. The skin, dusted white like porcelain, not for vanity but for visibility, to glow under candlelight. Her lips painted small and precise, the shape meant to resemble a blossoming camellia. Eyebrows faint, nearly absent, as if to shift expression from the face to the eyes. And the eyes, shaded just enough to seem eternal, unreadable. By the time the transformation was complete, she no longer looked human. She looked like art. The clients waiting beyond the screen didn't want a person. They wanted perfection, that impossible image that existed between dream and memory. The courtesan gave them that. Not by hiding her humanity, but by sculpting it. When she finally stepped outside, everything changed. The sound of wooden clogs, geta, echoed softly on the wet street. Each step was deliberate, measured, elegant. The crowd parted. Her procession was known as the Oiran the grand parade of the high courtesans. She was followed by attendants, musicians, and younger apprentices carrying her fan and lantern. Onlookers lined the street, merchants, children, travelers. They didn't call out or reach toward her. They simply watched, awed, as though a living painting had stepped down from a scroll. Her walk was the essence of her art. She lifted each foot slowly, twisting it slightly as she set it down, a style called hachimanji, meaning figure eight. It looked effortless, but was grueling to maintain. The heavy robes dragged against her legs, the tall clogs forced balance from the hips. Yet she never wavered. In that walk, you could read centuries of restraint. It was elegance distilled from endurance. People often describe Yoshiwara as Japan's city of pleasure. But that phrase misses the truth. Pleasure was only the surface. Underneath was theater. A courtesan didn't sell her body, she sold an evening's dream. Each gesture, each glance, was staged like a performance, the smile timed, the silence deliberate. When she poured sake, it wasn't just hospitality. It was choreography. Even conversation was art. She might quote a line from Basho, then twist it into flirtation. She might answer a compliment with a poem instead of words. The goal wasn't intimacy, it was rhythm. A dance of suggestion that never quite resolved. In that sense, she was closer to an actress than a lover. Her audience came for the story. Let's imagine the scene again. A small tatami room glowing with lantern light. The courtesan enters, her silk whispering as she kneels. Across from her sits a merchant, a man who has worked his whole life counting coins and measuring rice, suddenly nervous in her presence. She smiles faintly, lifts the sake pot, and asks if he's traveled far. He nods, unsure whether to speak. She pours his cup. The liquid catches the light like molten gold. She recites a short poem. Tonight the moon hides its face. But still I pour the sake. The merchant laughs softly, unsure if it's a joke or a compliment. She doesn't explain. She just tilts her head and changes the subject, to the weather, to plum blossoms, to the fleetingness of all things. And there it is, the illusion. Not seduction, but serenity. A feeling of connection that isn't quite real, but feels real enough. It's important to understand, in Edo Japan, love itself was theatrical. The courtesan's role wasn't to satisfy desire, but to give it form. When you left her presence, you weren't sated, you were haunted. Her image lingered. The curve of her voice, the scent of her robe, the weight of what was never said. She became a ghost of beauty that followed you long after you went home. This, the scholars say, was the foundation of Iki, the refined aesthetic of understated allure. It meant being graceful without trying, passionate without confession, beautiful without arrogance. The courtesans perfected it. Iki became the soul of Edo culture. Painters tried to capture it. Poets tried to define it. Merchants tried to imitate it in dress and speech. But in truth, only the women of Yoshiwara lived it. Now, if you had walked through Yoshiwara at its height, you would have seen more than courtesans. You would have seen artists, actors, and writers, all borrowing from each other. The kabuki theater took its gestures from the Oiran, the tilt of the head, the slow turn of the wrist, the precise use of silence. In return, the courtesans borrowed stage flair, the ability to hold an audience with stillness. Painters like Harunobu and Utamaro immortalized them in woodblock prints. They didn't paint courtesans as victims, but as ideals, the faces of a dream world. And those prints, sold across the country, spread the fashion and mystique of Yoshiwara far beyond its gates. Everywhere, people began imitating the floating world, the hairstyles, the colors, even the mannerisms. The courtesans became icons of taste. It's strange, isn't it? That the women most confined became the models for how Japan defined elegance. But behind that beauty, exhaustion always lurked. The processions, the guests, the performances, they never truly stopped. An Oiran smile was a mask held for hours, sometimes days. Her voice never broke character. Even illness had to wait until morning. There are records of courtesans collapsing mid-performance, quietly excused so that the illusion could continue. In Yoshiwara, beauty was duty. To falter was to fail. Yet within that cruelty was also pride. For many, maintaining the illusion was proof of mastery. They endured not for the men, but for themselves. Because to lose composure was to lose everything they had worked for, the years of training, the reputation, the artistry. Theirs was a discipline that blurred the line between devotion and sacrifice. Some say that the courtesans of Edo were Japan's first performance artists. They used their bodies, clothes, and words to construct meaning, to make the invisible visible. Their fashion was a language. The color of a kimono could signal emotion, deep purple for mystery, crimson for vitality, pale green for renewal. A folded fan, half open, meant invitation. Fully closed meant farewell. The angle of a hairpin could declare status or mood. Even the act of removing a sleeve during dance had meaning, a gesture of transformation, as though shedding one life for another. These details weren't random. They were deliberate, codified, rehearsed. Yoshiwara's women became fluent in symbolism the way monks became fluent in scripture. Their bodies spoke in poetry long before the poets wrote it down. The rituals of the courtesans changed with the seasons. In spring, they adorned themselves with cherry blossoms, symbols of impermanence. In summer, with cool blues and fans shaped like dragonflies. In autumn, russet and gold, echoing the color of fallen leaves. And in winter, stark whites and silvers, beauty in stillness. These changes weren't vanity, they were philosophy. To exist in harmony with impermanence was the highest aesthetic virtue. And so, the courtesan's art mirrored life itself, fleeting, fragile, impossible to capture. A perfect metaphor for all the things we chase but never hold. As the centuries turned, the line between courtesan and artist became so blurred that even foreign visitors couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Some Dutch traders in Nagasaki wrote of meeting women who sang like poets and moved like dancers, who seemed to belong to another world entirely. They were right. Yoshiwara was another world, an island of art floating above the grime of the city, built on illusion and maintained by devotion. It's easy to judge it now, to call it false, exploitative, even cruel. And it was all of those things. But it was also something else, the birthplace of a national aesthetic. Without Yoshiwara, Japan's sense of beauty might have been entirely different. Because the courtesans didn't just reflect culture, they created it. And yet, every illusion must end. As the Edo period waned, and Western influence crept in, Yoshiwara began to fade. The rituals that once defined refinement started to look old-fashioned. The Oiran's towering hairstyles seemed excessive compared to the simpler beauty of the new geisha. Clients dwindled. Houses closed. The floating world began to sink. But for a few final decades, the performance continued. Even as the world outside changed, as steamships and telegraphs arrived, the courtesans walked their slow, figure-eight steps through the same streets, under the same lanterns, holding the past in place through sheer grace. There's a certain nobility in that, in continuing to perform beauty even when no one is watching. So tonight, as you lie there listening, imagine one of them walking through that last winter. Snow falling softly on her lacquered hair. Lantern light flickering across frozen ground. her silk dragging behind her like the remnants of a dream. She knows her world is dying. But she walks anyway, slow, poised, deliberate, because that's what she was taught. Let the movement breathe. And in that single act, she becomes eternal. Next time, we'll step into Part 5, where Yoshiwara meets the Meiji era, a world of change, westernization, and the slow unraveling of everything these women built. We'll see how their legacy transformed into the art of the geisha, and how illusion became history. But before we end tonight, I'll ask you again, softly, before you drift away. If your life were a performance, what illusion would you choose to keep alive? Sleep well. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, that's impressive. But if you're already half asleep, that's fine too. That's kind of the point. Tonight, let's drift a little deeper into the heart of Edo Japan's floating world, a place where beauty didn't just entertain, it inspired. Because somewhere between the echo of shamisen strings and the fading scent of incense, the courtesans became something else entirely. They became muses. And not the quiet, passive kind. These were living symbols that painters, poets, and playwrights couldn't stop chasing. The artists came to Yoshiwara for inspiration, and left with obsession. Art, in Edo Japan, was a strange and delicate ecosystem. Painters needed patrons. Poets needed new metaphors. Actors needed roles. And in the floating world, they found all three, wrapped in silk, painted in powder, and smiling behind a folding fan. The courtesans weren't just models, they were collaborators. Many of them were highly literate, educated in calligraphy, poetry, and literature, and some even wrote their own verses. Their conversations became as famous as their beauty. They could quote classical poetry as easily as they could pour tea, and that blend of wit and allure left artists utterly bewitched. Imagine a poet visiting Yoshiwara for the first time. He's nervous. He's carrying a notebook, trying to act casual. The courtesan greets him with a smile that's polite but distant. She listens as he recites his poem, something about moonlight and longing, and then she replies with a better one. He's ruined, of course. He'll spend the next decade writing about her. The connection between courtesans and art wasn't just emotional, it was commercial. Edo artists, especially the ukiyo-e printmakers, built their reputations on images of the floating world. The very term ukiyo-e means pictures of the floating world. These woodblock prints captured scenes of pleasure districts, kabuki actors, and of course, courtesans. In a way, the courtesans were the supermodels of their time. Their portraits hung in shops and tea houses. Men collected prints of their favorite Oiran like fans today collect celebrity posters. Some even claimed to fall in love with women they'd never met, just the image of them, fixed forever in ink and color. It's strange, isn't it? To adore an image more than the person. But then again, that's kind of what Yoshiwara was about, worshipping illusion until it felt real. Let's picture one of those printmakers now. It's late, and he's sitting by lamplight, carving the delicate lines of a woman's face into a block of cherry wood. Every curve of the cheek, every strand of hair, every fold of the kimono has to be perfect. One wrong cut, and the illusion is ruined. When the print is finished, it shows a courtesan glancing sideways, her expression unreadable, her beauty idealized. She's not smiling, not sad, just distant. That distance is what makes her magnetic. The painter doesn't name her, but everyone knows who she is. Maybe she's Takao, the most famous Oiran of her generation. Or Haneaji, whose calligraphy could rival any poet's. Or maybe she's no one, a composite of memory and imagination. Either way, the print sells out. Collectors hang it in their homes, believing they own a piece of her. But of course, they don't. They only own the echo. That's how myth begins, when repetition replaces reality. The more artists painted the courtesans, the more they stopped being individuals. They became types, archetypes, symbols of grace and mystery. Their human complexity flattened into patterns of silk and powder. Yet within that idealization, there was also preservation. Thanks to those artists, the courtesans didn't vanish when Yoshiwara did. Their faces survived, frozen in ink, gazing forever into the middle distance, untouched by time. It's ironic, really. They spent their lives creating illusions, and the artists made sure those illusions outlived them. Now, if you've ever looked at an ukiyo-e print, you'll notice something interesting. The courtesans don't usually meet your gaze. They're always turned slightly away, eyes drifting somewhere else, maybe toward the moon, or a garden, or perhaps something beyond the frame entirely. It's a small thing, but it changes everything. That averted gaze makes them seem unreachable, untouchable, which, of course, was the point. Even in print, the courtesans knew how to maintain the performance. They could seduce through absence. Some of the most celebrated artists of Edo Japan, Utamaro, Harunobu, Toyokuni, devoted their careers to portraying courtesans. Utamaro in particular was obsessed with capturing feminine expression. He painted women combing their hair, gazing at mirrors, writing letters. Nothing scandalous, just quiet moments of beauty. His prints were like whispered conversations, intimate but distant, personal yet universal. It's easy to forget, while admiring them, that many of the women he painted lived lives of exhaustion and control. But Utamaro saw something eternal in them, something worth recording. In one of his most famous works, he shows a courtesan touching her earlobe. The gesture is so small it almost disappears. But it feels real, human, and tender. For a moment, you forget she's a symbol. You see her as a person. And then, of course, you remember, that person no longer exists. Only the art remains. Poets were no less enchanted. They wrote about courtesans as if they were constellations. One compared his favorite to a floating lantern on a misty canal. Another said her beauty softened the edge of time. It's hard to tell whether these poets truly admired the women themselves, or simply the emotions they represented: longing, transience, desire restrained by decorum. The courtesan became a metaphor for everything fleeting. To love her was to accept impermanence. And in that sense, she became a stand-in for life itself, beautiful, brief, impossible to hold. Of course, not everyone approved. The moralists of Edo society complained that artists were glorifying sin, encouraging indulgence, corrupting the people. The government occasionally cracked down on art depicting the pleasure districts. Some prints were censored, others banned outright. But censorship only made them more desirable. People smuggled prints across the city, hidden inside scrolls or folded into books. Desire always finds a way, especially when it's beautifully printed. Meanwhile, kabuki theater took inspiration from the courtesans too. Early kabuki actually began as women's performance, ana kabuki, before the government banned it for being too scandalous. The irony, of course, is that men then took over the roles, dressing as courtesans and mimicking their gestures with theatrical precision. The male actors, called onagata, spent their entire careers studying how to embody femininity. They watched courtesans closely, how they walked, how they held a fan, how they tilted their heads while listening. Every motion became part of the stage language. So even when the real courtesans couldn't perform publicly, their art lived on in the theater, reimagined by men, exaggerated, stylized, but still undeniably theirs. It's oddly poetic, isn't it? A reflection of a reflection, until no one remembers where the real image began. There's something almost ghostly about it. Every time a kabuki actor performs a courtesan's role, he's channeling centuries of memory. His movements, his posture, even the cadence of his voice come from women long gone, women who once walked those narrow lantern-lit streets. The floating world vanished, but it keeps surfacing, in art, in theater, in memory. Like a reflection on water that refuses to fade. And what about the courtesans themselves? Did they see the art made about them? Did they ever look at a print and think, "Ah, that's me, though I don't quite look like that"? Some probably did. Others likely never cared. For them, art was part of the business, another layer of the illusion. Their likeness made them famous, but it also trapped them. A man could fall in love with the image of her and never notice the real woman sitting across from him, exhausted, her fingers stained from calligraphy ink. Fame, like beauty, was both gift and burden. Still, art gave them a strange kind of immortality. Even centuries later, we can look at Utamaro's prints or read old poems and feel their presence. We'll never know their true voices or their laughter, but we sense the aura, that quiet dignity, that calm allure that once ruled a city of dreams. It's easy to forget that these women weren't supposed to be remembered. Their world was built to disappear, a floating world, after all, meant to drift away. And yet, here we are, still talking about them. They may have been forgotten by their patrons, but history, reluctantly, accidentally, kept their names. If you look closely, you can even see the courtesan's influence today, in fashion photography, in film, in the way beauty is still staged and sold. The idea that allure depends on distance, that mystery is part of charm, that's Yoshiwara's legacy. They taught the world that beauty isn't about revealing everything. It's about revealing just enough. So perhaps the courtesans were artists after all. Not because they painted or wrote, but because they understood the art of perception, how to control what others see and what they'll never know. They curated their lives like living paintings. Every glance, every word, every movement was composition. And in that sense, they achieved what most artists only dream of. They turned themselves into art. As you settle into sleep, imagine them once more, the muses of the floating world, captured forever in colors that never fade. The prints still whisper faintly through time, carrying stories of beauty and endurance, illusion and truth. They remind us that art isn't always about what's real. Sometimes it's about what we choose to believe. Next, we'll drift softly into Part 6, where the illusion begins to unravel, when Japan's modernization and westernization began to erase the floating world entirely, leaving only echoes of silk and song behind. But before we go, if someone painted your life, what moment would you want them to capture? Tell me in the comments, after you've drifted off a little, of course. Hey everyone! If you're still awake, you've made it deep into the quiet heart of Edo's floating world. The lanterns have burned low by now, and the chatter outside the tea-houses has softened into the faint scrape of a shamisen string. Tonight, we'll drift into another layer, the education of the courtesan, not just in charm or conversation, but in art itself. Because in the Yoshiwara, beauty wasn't only seen. It was studied, rehearsed, and perfected until it could almost be called an academic pursuit. When we talk about courtesans as artists, we aren't being poetic. Many of them trained with real painters, poets, and calligraphers. They were expected to master dance, musical performance, and letter writing, not merely for pleasure, but as proof of refinement. The Yoshiwara was a social theater, after all. Every gesture was part of a performance. Even pouring sake had choreography. But let's start with one quiet figure, Katsuragi. She lived in the mid-18th century and was known less for her looks than for her calligraphy. Customers would come not for her smile, but for a poem she might compose between sips of tea. In a world that measured beauty by the curve of a sleeve or the glint of hair oil, that was something unusual. Katsuragi's handwriting became famous in the ukiyo-e prints of the time, flowing lines, confident and unbroken. You could almost hear the sound of the brush sliding across the paper. And she wasn't alone. Most high-ranking courtesans learned to paint in the Yamato-e style, delicate watercolors that captured scenes of nature or fleeting emotions. Some even designed patterns for kimono fabrics. It's a strange sort of irony, women locked away behind the walls of pleasure districts, yet shaping the visual language of beauty for an entire culture. There was a sense of shared artistry between the courtesan and the craftsman. The hairdresser, for instance, wasn't simply maintaining a style, he was sculpting identity. The elaborate towers of hair worn by top courtesans could take hours, sometimes most of the afternoon, to create. Each comb, each pin, each thread of waxed hair carried symbolic weight. The styles even had names, like the Takashimada or Uewata, and could announce rank, personality, or affiliation. In the dim rooms of the brothels, this preparation was its own kind of ritual. Layers of white makeup, powdered rice, and rouge turned the face into a mask, not of falseness, but of transformation. A courtesan was supposed to transcend herself, to become a living image of ideal beauty. There's something almost sacred in that repetition, don't you think? A daily ceremony in which a woman turned her own body into a canvas. The term artist in Edo didn't mean quite what it does now. It wasn't about self-expression, at least, not overtly. It was about discipline. To be elegant was to have control. To appear effortless required hours of unseen effort. The courtesan's life was an act of restraint. And maybe that's what made it so mesmerizing to her audience, the illusion of ease. One visitor to Yoshiwara once wrote that watching a courtesan perform was like seeing a swan drift across a pond. You never notice how hard the feet are paddling below. That image fits perfectly. Her laughter, her gestures, her silences, all measured, deliberate. Even her pauses were rehearsed. You might imagine this would feel suffocating. And yes, it often did. Many courtesans wrote poems about longing, not just for freedom, but for sincerity. They spent their lives surrounded by imitation affection. So they expressed their real emotions in coded verses, hidden among layers of metaphor. You could tell a lot about a woman's private feelings by the themes she chose. Mist, autumn, or withered flowers were common signs of melancholy. If you look closely at ukiyo-e prints depicting these women, you'll often see a small detail, a letter on the table, half unrolled. It's easy to miss, but it's there for a reason. Love letters written by courtesans were collected, traded, and sometimes even forged. Their handwriting itself became an object of desire. Imagine that, someone falling in love not with your face or voice, but with the way your brush moves across paper. The art of correspondence was a serious affair. Clients prized eloquent letters more than gifts. A single well-crafted note could extend a patronage by months. Courtesans would sometimes spend hours crafting a reply, consulting with other women or copying phrases from classical poetry. Every stroke was calculated, romantic, but never too personal, grateful, but never desperate. The perfect tone balanced charm with distance. Too affectionate, and she risked losing control. Too cold, and she risked losing the client. It was an emotional tightrope, walked with a brush. And if you're thinking this all sounds exhausting, you're right. But it was also empowering, in a peculiar way. These women mastered communication in a society that often denied them direct speech. They couldn't argue politics or property, but they could manipulate desire, conversation, and atmosphere. They spoke through aesthetics. That was their language of power. Let's drift, now, to a different form of artistry, music. The shamisen was the courtesan's instrument of choice. Its sound, somewhere between melancholy and mischief, defined the ambience of the Yoshiwara. The songs were not classical compositions, but intimate improvisations. Lyrics often told subtle jokes or referenced fleeting romantic moods. The best players could make their audience laugh softly one moment and tear up the next. The irony here is that while the outside world saw these women as pleasure providers, they were also cultural curators. The Yoshiwara had its own aesthetic codes, its own slang, its own hierarchy of taste. People outside the district often imitated its fashions, even as they condemned it morally. The courtesans set trends in everything from hairstyle to perfume. They dictated what was considered refined, even though they themselves were technically outcasts. The contradictions ran deep. A courtesan could read poetry but not walk freely outside her district. She could correspond with nobles but could never marry them. She was admired by artists yet excluded from polite society. It's the kind of irony history seems to enjoy repeating, talent trapped by the very world it elevates. When you think about it, the Yoshiwara was Japan's first true influencer culture. Every gesture, every style, was copied by people who would never admit where it came from. The courtesans were the uncredited authors of their era's beauty. Let's pause a moment on that thought, the idea of influence without recognition. How many artists, especially women, have existed in the shadow of systems that consumed their creativity but denied their names? The Yoshiwara was full of ghosts like that. One of them, Takao, became so famous for her performances that she was immortalized in theater and prints. She was witty, sharp-tongued, and famously refused to flatter men she didn't like, which made her even more desirable, of course. But her story, like so many, ended quietly, in debt and illness. She died before 30, and the district moved on without her. Her art remained, but her name faded. That's the quiet cruelty of transience, wrapped up in the poetry of the floating world. It's tempting to romanticize all this, to imagine the courtesans as serene, wise figures moving through candlelight. But the truth was far messier. For every legendary beauty, there were dozens of women struggling to survive, their artistry unrecorded, their poems lost. The Yoshiwara was a dream for some, a cage for others. Yet even inside that cage, they created meaning, through art, through elegance, through the simple insistence that beauty could matter even when freedom didn't. When modern writers look back, they often describe the courtesans as muses. But maybe that's not quite fair. They weren't inspiring someone else's art, they were making their own. And maybe that's what separates them from the Western idea of prostitution. They weren't defined by what they gave, but by what they created. So tonight, as we drift through this quiet hour, think about that. How creation can come from confinement, how grace can emerge from constraint. These women found expression in the smallest of gestures, a turn of the wrist, a fold of fabric, a syllable held too long. It wasn't rebellion exactly, but it was resistance in its own language. If you were living in Edo, Japan, and found yourself walking the lantern-lit streets of the Yoshiwara, do you think you'd have noticed the art, or just the illusion? Tell me in the comments, if you like. Let's drift onward, then, into the next part, where the floating world begins to blur with the real one, and the courtesan's artistry finds itself in danger from modernization, morality, and the slow unraveling of an old Japan. Hey everyone, welcome back. If your eyes are still open, or half open, you're doing better than most people around this part of the story. Tonight, we're leaving behind the soft rustle of kimono sleeves and the hush of the shamisen. The Yoshiwara still glimmers for now, but a chill wind is starting to move through its paper walls. It's the 19th century, and the modern world is quietly, politely, knocking on the door. At first, nothing seemed to change. The courtesans still performed, the patrons still arrived in carriages, and the poets still wrote about moonlight and desire. But outside the gates of Yoshiwara, Japan was waking from 2 centuries of self-contained dreams. Steamships appeared in the bay. Foreign diplomats, with their starched suits and odd manners, began attending court. And somewhere in all of that bustle, the very idea of beauty was about to change. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was many things: political upheaval, industrial revolution, cultural rebranding. But for the courtesans of Edo, it was a slow unraveling. Their world had always depended on isolation, on rules, boundaries, and ritual. Modernity didn't have much patience for any of that. It wanted progress, hygiene, and moral reform. And so, in the name of civilization, Japan began sweeping away the very traditions that had made its pleasure quarters such complex, artistic ecosystems. Western visitors often wrote about Yoshiwara with fascination, though not always with understanding. They compared it to Parisian salons or London theaters, missing entirely the layers of ritual and artistry that made it distinct. To them, the courtesans were curiosities, proof of an exotic East, beautiful and backward at once. You can almost imagine a visiting diplomat stepping out of a carriage, top hat slightly askew, gazing at the lanterns and the soft light glinting off lacquered hair, thinking he had stumbled into a painting. He had, in a way, but it was a painting already beginning to fade. The Meiji government's new obsession with Western morality was especially cruel to the courtesans. Reformers spoke of progress and public health, which sounded noble enough, until you realized it mostly meant criminalizing women who had little say in their own lives. In 1872, the government declared prostitution officially free, which, paradoxically, made it more regulated than ever. Women were required to register, undergo medical inspections, and live in licensed quarters. Freedom, it turned out, came with paperwork. For the high-ranking courtesans, the ones once celebrated as poets and performers, this shift was humiliating. They were suddenly lumped together with common prostitutes, stripped of their cultural status. Imagine spending your life mastering poetry, dance, etiquette, and art, only to be reclassified as a public health problem. The irony must have stung worse than the reforms themselves. Some of them tried to adapt. They rebranded as geisha, though that term originally had a different meaning. The geisha had been entertainers, not courtesans, and traditionally kept some distance from the erotic world. Over time, however, those distinctions blurred. The courtesans' artistic traditions were absorbed into the geisha's performance culture, while their reputations were quietly erased. It's strange, isn't it? The art lived on, but the artists were forgotten. As Western fashion seeped into Japanese cities, so too did Western ideas of morality. Victorian prudishness met Edo sensuality, and, naturally, they didn't get along. Where Yoshiwara had once celebrated pleasure as an art form, a kind of aesthetic harmony between body and spirit, the new age saw it as sin, or worse, embarrassment. The courtesan's white face and ornate hair now looked old-fashioned, even grotesque, next to the new image of modern womanhood, simple, modest, Western-dressed. The painters felt it too. Ukiyo-e prints, once filled with lavish images of courtesans, began losing their audience. Woodblock printing itself was fading, replaced by photography and modern illustration. And the first photographers of Japan, eager to please foreign customers, often reduced the courtesan's image to a stereotype: the submissive beauty, the silent doll, the oriental fantasy. In the span of a few decades, centuries of complex cultural artistry had been flattened into a postcard cliché. Still, some refused to disappear quietly. There's a quiet story of one woman, her name was Kyoha, who, in the 1880s, ran a small salon that blended old and new. She hosted tea gatherings where guests could view Western paintings, but she herself still wore the high hair and layered kimono of the Yoshiwara. To her, art was continuity, not rebellion. People whispered that she was old-fashioned, but she saw herself as a bridge, between centuries, between ideals. Of course, time rarely rewards bridges. Her salon closed after 10 years. The neighborhood around it was demolished to make way for new government offices. But I like to imagine her walking through the changing streets of Tokyo, holding a paper parasol against the gaslight glow, perhaps smiling faintly at how the world had hurried past without quite noticing what it lost. There's something deeply human about that, the quiet dignity of people who keep creating even as their world crumbles. The Courtesans weren't revolutionaries, but they were stubbornly devoted to beauty. In that devotion, there's a kind of rebellion after all. By the late 19th century, the Yoshiwara still existed, but it had become a ghost of itself. The streets were paved, the old gates repaired after fires, the brothels rebuilt with modern materials. But the atmosphere, that peculiar blend of grace and melancholy, was gone. Foreign visitors came to gawk, not to appreciate. Locals came out of habit, not reverence. What had once been a living painting became a museum piece, and eventually, a memory. If you walk there today, and yes, the district still exists, sort of, you'll find modern buildings and neon signs where the courtesan houses once stood. There's a small monument, almost hidden, that commemorates the women of Yoshiwara. It's easy to miss. Most people do. But if you stop and read the inscription, it speaks of art and endurance, which feels like a fitting summary for everything they stood for. Let's drift for a moment into the quieter side of this transformation, the emotional one. For centuries, Japan had celebrated impermanence, the idea that beauty fades, and that its fading is part of its charm. But modernity doesn't really like impermanence. It prefers permanence, progress, data, development. There's little room for melancholy. So, as Japan raced toward its future, the floating world, the place built on impermanence, found itself out of tune with the times. The courtesans were the living embodiment of that old philosophy. Their art was transient by nature, a dance, a glance, a poem written in the moment. They didn't produce lasting monuments, they produced experiences. And experiences don't survive modernization very well. When the railways came, and telegrams, and newspapers filled with Western headlines, there was suddenly less space for subtlety, less time for drifting beauty. And yet, some of their aesthetic lingered. You can see it in the paintings of early 20th century artists like Kaburaki Kayokata, who captured women in half-forgotten poses, their faces illuminated by lamplight. You can hear it in the melancholic music of the Nagauta, songs that trace their roots to the Yoshiwara's twilight. You can even feel it in the modern tea ceremony, with its precise, graceful movements. The courtesan's art never truly vanished. It just slipped into new forms, quieter ones. When you think about it, that's what happens to all art born from repression. It hides in plain sight. It becomes gesture, tradition, habit. Even now, Japanese aesthetics still carry traces of that floating world, the attention to fleeting beauty, to the spaces between words, to the emotion that lingers rather than explodes. Sometimes, when people study the decline of the Yoshiwara, they focus on the economic or moral angles, the corruption, the diseases, the political hypocrisy. But perhaps what really ended was something less tangible, a shared belief that beauty could be its own justification. The Meiji era didn't have much patience for that. Everything had to serve a purpose, economic, educational, industrial. There was little space left for beauty that existed only to be admired. Still, I like to think that the courtesans would have understood the irony. They were used to being appreciated and condemned at the same time. They lived their whole lives in contradiction. Maybe they'd simply nod, pour another cup of sake, and say, "So, the world moves on." It's odd, though, the same Westerners who helped dismantle their world also preserved its memory. European collectors bought up ukiyo-e prints by the thousands, treating them as high art. Artists like Monet and Van Gogh fell in love with those images of courtesans, mistaking them for symbols of some eternal Japanese grace. In a roundabout way, the women of Yoshiwara influenced modern Western art. They were gone, but their faces, stylized, serene, unbothered, lived on in museums and canvases. So maybe the floating world didn't quite sink. It just drifted westward. You can almost imagine one of those old courtesans, sitting in her quiet room, unaware that her portrait would someday hang in a Paris gallery. If someone had told her that her image would inspire painters half a world away, she might have smiled, faintly, and said, "Ah, so that's what all this was for." It's a strange comfort, isn't it? To think that even forgotten beauty can echo across time. That something as fleeting as a brushstroke, or a glance beneath lantern light, could ripple outward for centuries. And if you're still awake, maybe you're thinking about how many other worlds have vanished like that, replaced by modern efficiency, tidied up in the name of progress. The Courtesans remind us that there's always a cost to civilization's upgrades. What we call improvement often begins with erasure. Tell me in the comments, if you had lived through that change, would you have clung to the old world or stepped into the new one? Hey everyone! If you're still awake, or only half awake, you're doing fine. Tonight, we're leaving the gaslit alleys of Meiji Tokyo behind and stepping quietly into the early 20th century, a world that still remembered the scent of camellia oil and the sound of shamisen strings, but now saw them through the flicker of movie screens. It's funny, isn't it? The more modern a society becomes, the more it romanticizes what it just left behind. For Japan, that meant turning the once scandalous courtesan into a nostalgic symbol of elegance, the perfect subject for novels, plays, and later, film. The same women who had been dismissed as immoral under the Meiji government suddenly became cultural treasures when the world realized their grace was vanishing. The irony would have made them smile, I think. By the 1910s and 1920s, the word Yoshiwara no longer meant sin, it meant style. The district still operated, but its energy had changed. Electricity had replaced lanterns, cars had replaced rickshaws, and silk kimono brushed against Western shoes. Yet for the new generation of writers and artists, that fading contrast was irresistible. Authors like Nagai Kafu wandered the remnants of the pleasure quarters, notebook in hand, recording every flicker of what was left. He described courtesans as ghosts in daylight, women too refined for the age of machines. His writing was wistful, soft, and full of contradictions, the perfect bedtime literature, really. He saw beauty in decay, charm in obsolescence. Kafu wasn't alone. Painters, photographers, and early filmmakers all fell under the spell of Yoshiwara nostalgia. They dressed actresses in antique kimono, recreated the narrow streets, and filmed scenes that looked like dreams of the past. By then, the real courtesans had mostly vanished or aged into anonymity. But on film, they became eternal. There's something both sweet and sad about that, a living art turned into moving images, captured forever yet never alive again. The early Japanese film industry was particularly fond of fallen beauty stories, the woman trapped between duty and desire, tradition and modernity. You can see the shadow of the courtesan in almost every one of them. Even Western audiences noticed. By the 1930s, the idea of the Japanese courtesan, refined, tragic, mysterious, had spread abroad through art exhibitions and imported prints. The Yoshiwara, once a single-walled district, had become a global fantasy. Of course, like all fantasies, it told more about the dreamers than the subject. When the Second World War came, much of Tokyo burned, including what was left of the old Yoshiwara. Fires erased the streets where generations of women had lived, worked, and performed. The war didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed memory. But memories are stubborn things. After the war, as Japan rebuilt itself from ashes, nostalgia returned again. This time, it came in color film. In the 1950s and 1960s, directors like Mizoguchi Kenji and Ichikawa Kan made films about the lives of women in old Japan. Geisha, courtesans, wives, mistresses, exploring their quiet endurance within systems built to contain them. Mizoguchi, in particular, was fascinated by the idea of beauty as suffering. His film The Life of Oharu captured that perfectly, a woman once adored, then discarded, drifting through life with dignity even in ruin. It's almost a metaphor for Yoshiwara itself. You could say those post-war films weren't really about the past. They were about grief, about a country mourning the loss of its old identity. The courtesan became a symbol not of decadence, but of fragile beauty, of Japan's vanishing soul. And just like that, the same image that had once been condemned became a mirror for national memory. But outside the cinema, the world had changed for good. The post-war boom turned Tokyo into a city of neon, noise, and efficiency. The quiet, ritualized pleasures of the floating world felt almost impossible to imagine. Still, something lingered, in the tea-houses of Kyoto, in the posture of an older geisha, in the choreography of politeness that still shaped everyday life. Modern Japanese culture, for all its technology, still moves to the rhythm of those old aesthetics. The slow pour of tea, the bow, the pause before speaking, they're all echoes of a society that once believed in beauty as a form of control. The courtesans, in their way, were masters of that rhythm. Let's pause here for a breath, the kind of pause they would have admired. You can almost hear the faint creak of a shamisen string somewhere in the background, the ghost of a melody that no longer has words. That's what nostalgia does, it turns silence into song. In the decades after the war, the memory of the courtesan shifted again. Academic historians began to study Yoshiwara seriously, not as a scandalous curiosity but as a microcosm of Edo society, an intricate network of economy, class, art, and gender. What they found surprised many people. The courtesan system had been as much about performance and prestige as about pleasure. It was a world governed by aesthetics, not instincts. This reframing was important. It helped reclaim the idea that art and sexuality weren't mutually exclusive. For the courtesans, beauty was labor. Every smile was a negotiation, every performance a contract. To reduce them to prostitutes was to miss the entire cultural mechanism that surrounded them, the art, the poetry, the ritual. But of course, history always simplifies. As the years passed, Yoshiwara became a tourist attraction, a romanticized setting for dramas and photo shoots. Glossy magazines published retro beauty, spreads with models dressed as Oiran, elaborate hairpieces, impossibly high sandals, layers of embroidered silk. Most people didn't realize how heavy those costumes actually were, how they required hours to put on, how walking even a few meters could be exhausting. They were literally performances of beauty, reimagined for the camera, stripped of context. It's easy to criticize that kind of nostalgia. But maybe there's something human in it, the desire to remember the beauty without the pain, to polish the memory until it shines. The Yoshiwara of the modern imagination is cleaner, brighter, more romantic than the real one ever was. But that, too, is an art form. And so the courtesan, once flesh and blood, became a symbol again, of discipline, of melancholy, of timeless grace. A strange kind of afterlife, but perhaps not a bad one. Some modern artists have tried to bring the courtesans back into the conversation, not as decoration, but as thinkers. Exhibit curators have displayed their poems alongside their portraits. Scholars have traced their influence on Japanese aesthetics, the idea of iki, or chic restraint, the ideal of aware, the sensitivity to fleeting beauty. Even in absence, they shaped how a culture defines elegance. It's a bit ironic, though, the women who once fought to be taken seriously as artists are now admired precisely for their mystery, their elusiveness. History, it seems, enjoys a good paradox. If you wander through Tokyo today, you can still find faint traces of the old Yoshiwara. A few street names remain, though most people passing by don't know their meaning. A small museum preserves hair ornaments, letters, and fans, relics of a vanished art form. Standing in front of those glass cases, you can feel an odd mix of sadness and peace. The colors have faded, but the care is still visible, every detail carved, embroidered, or painted with precision. The art of attention, frozen in time. What fascinates me most is how these objects, a comb, a folded letter, a silk cord, speak more clearly than words. They were tools of self-expression in a world that allowed women so few voices. The courtesans created art that didn't need to shout, it whispered. That's what makes it so powerful, even now. And maybe that's why their legacy still feels relevant in the age of social media and constant display. The courtesans perfected the art of presentation long before photography. They understood how to curate an image, how to control a narrative. They were influencers before the term existed, only their filters were made of silk and candlelight. What would they think of today's world, I wonder? A world where performance is constant, and attention is the currency? I suspect they'd adapt easily. After all, they spent lifetimes mastering the performance of self. They might even smile at our modern obsession with aesthetic. They invented that concept centuries ago. Still, the Yoshiwara they knew was smaller, slower, more deliberate. It valued pauses, not algorithms. In a strange way, it was more human, even in its artificiality. Maybe that's what draws people back to its memory. The longing for a slower form of beauty, one that requires effort and patience. So as we drift through this part of the story, think about that. How something born in confinement could teach a whole culture how to move, how to look, how to be. The courtesans might have vanished, but the rhythm they set, deliberate, graceful, restrained, still hums quietly under Japan's modern surface. There's an old saying from the Edo period, Yukio wa yum, yo emo yum. The floating world is a dream, and the world itself is a dream. It's the kind of phrase that sounds profound at first, and then just feels soft, like a sigh. Maybe that's the perfect way to remember Yoshiwara, not as a place of sin or sorrow, but as a dream Japan once had about itself. If you could step into that dream, for just one night, lanterns glowing, silk rustling, voices drifting through the mist, would you want to? Tell me in the comments, if you're still awake. Hey there, welcome back. If you followed the story this far, you've already walked through candlelit corridors, smoky tea houses, and forgotten alleys. You've heard the rustle of silk, the faint echo of shamisen strings, and the soft laughter of women who learned to turn grace into survival. Tonight, we've reached the final chapter, the long afterglow that lingers after the floating world faded away. You see, history never truly ends. It just changes its costume. Even though the Yoshiwara burned, and the courtesans vanished from daily life, something of them remained, not in the flesh, but in gesture, design, and mood. Their world of deliberate beauty, of artful emotion, still hums beneath Japan's modern rhythm, like a lone note beneath a melody. If you walk through modern Tokyo, you won't find the courtesans. You'll find skyscrapers, LED lights, and crowds staring into phones. And yet, in the folds of a kimono, in the shape of a tea bowl, in the way someone bows with silence before speaking, you might still feel them. They have become part of Japan's aesthetic DNA. Let's start with fashion. The courtesan style in modern design. The Oiran had always been the high priestess of spectacle. Her appearance was theater. Every layer of silk, every lacquered pin, every step in her towering sandals carried meaning. To the untrained eye, it looked like excess. But to those who understood, it was discipline, a controlled explosion of beauty. When Japan opened to the West in the late 19th century, much of that fashion seemed old-fashioned, even embarrassing. But by the late 20th century, designers began looking back. They saw something powerful in that aesthetic, not modesty, but command. They borrowed it, reshaped it, and brought it to runways in Tokyo, Paris, and New York. The thick obi belts, once symbols of courtesan pride, reappeared as avant-garde fashion. Designers like Yohji Yamamoto and Rei Kawakubo turned the courtesan's complexity into abstraction, layers, folds, and asymmetry that whispered of mystery rather than explained it. Even modern kawaii culture, with its playful exaggeration and color, echoes something of the Yoshiwara, the performance of femininity as art. Every generation reinterprets beauty through its own lens. But the roots often run deeper than people realize. The Oiran silhouette, high hair, bold fabric, impossible posture, is still visible in Japanese pop culture, cosplay, and festival processions. In Kyoto and Niigata, Oiran dochu parades still march once a year, not as brothel spectacles, but as living art. Women dress in replica costumes and walk the streets slowly, carrying centuries of memory in every step. The crowd applauds. Cameras flash. And for a moment, the old dream flickers back to life. Art, film, and the memory of grace. But the courtesan's influence isn't just visual. It's emotional. Japanese filmmakers and artists have never stopped returning to that world. In the 2000s, Takashi Miike directed Sakuran, a stylized retelling of a courtesan's rise and rebellion. The film explodes with color, neon reds, shimmering golds, like a fever dream of the floating world reborn through punk energy. The soundtrack is modern, the attitude defiant, but the structure is ancient, beauty as armor, control as survival. That's the thing about the courtesan archetype, she doesn't vanish. She transforms. Sometimes she appears as a pop idol mastering the art of controlled charm. Sometimes as a businesswoman performing composure in boardrooms. Sometimes as a character in anime or literature who turns vulnerability into art. In each version, there's an echo of that same idea. The balance between presentation and truth, between desire and discipline. Writers still use the courtesan story as a metaphor for modern life, for how people curate their identities, sell versions of themselves, and survive within structures that expect performance. The Yoshiwara may be gone, but in a way, social media has become the new floating world, bright, alluring, temporary. We still craft images, chase attention, and trade authenticity for beauty. It's strange how little we've changed. Echoes in manners and everyday life. But the courtesan's legacy isn't just aesthetic or philosophical, it's practical. If you've ever been to Japan, you've probably noticed how politeness feels choreographed. The bow, the phrasing, the rhythm of speech, all precise, all intentional. This is not coincidence. The courtesans were among the first in Edo society to refine omotenashi, the art of hospitality. They mastered how to read a guest's mood, anticipate their needs, and create a seamless emotional atmosphere. From their example came a larger cultural standard. That service, when done beautifully, becomes a kind of art. Modern tea ceremonies, calligraphy lessons, and even luxury retail interactions still echo that same sensibility. When a department store clerk wraps your purchase with perfect folds, bows, and offers it with both hands, that's not just training. That's inheritance. It's the descendant of the courtesan's graceful etiquette, where every gesture carried meaning. There's something soothing about that idea, that even the smallest kindness in daily life can carry centuries of artistry. Maybe that's why Japan, despite being one of the most modern nations on earth, still feels deeply rooted in ritual. The courtesans helped teach the nation that beauty wasn't just decoration. It was behavior, the spiritual side of performance. And there's another layer, deeper, quieter, often overlooked. For many courtesans, beauty was not just social survival but spiritual expression. They came from Buddhist and Shinto traditions that viewed life as transient, fleeting, and cyclical. Their art reflected that. A song that ends too soon. A flower that blooms for one night. A romance that dissolves at dawn. This sensitivity, called mono no aware, the awareness of impermanence, became a cornerstone of Japanese aesthetics. You can see it in haiku, in landscape painting, in cherry blossom festivals. And though people often associate it with male poets or monks, it was the women of Yoshiwara who lived it most vividly. Their entire existence revolved around temporary beauty, makeup that faded, love that ended, fame that slipped away by morning. They understood impermanence not as tragedy, but as truth. To live beautifully within that truth, that was their art. And today, that philosophy still seeps quietly into Japanese life. From the way people watch the cherry blossoms fall, to the seasonal shifts in cuisine, to the humility in design, everything carries that sense of gentle acceptance. In a way, the courtesans didn't just shape art. They helped shape Japan's emotional intelligence. Modern feminism and reinterpretation. In the 21st century, scholars and artists have begun revisiting the courtesan's story from a feminist perspective. For a long time, history labeled them victims or seductresses, two extremes that erased their complexity. But now, researchers read their diaries, letters, and poetry differently. They see strategy in their choices, intellect in their craft, and autonomy in their performance. They see women who turned limited options into a kind of mastery. Some even compare them to Renaissance courtesans in Europe, educated, powerful within constraints, defining taste for an entire era. Exhibitions have been curated to explore this legacy. Books and documentaries discuss how courtesans cultivated networks of artists, writers, and patrons. They weren't just muses, they were curators of culture. They decided what beauty meant. That's a subtle but profound form of power. Modern Japanese women's movements sometimes reference these figures, not as moral warnings, but as symbols of resilience. The Oiran becomes an icon of agency, a reminder that femininity and intellect aren't contradictions, that performance can be strength, not submission. It's poetic justice, in a way. The women once silenced by history now speak again, through scholarship, through art, through admiration. Whispers in the city. If you ever visit the old Yoshiwara site today, it's quiet. There are no more courtesans, no red lanterns. The air smells of asphalt, not incense. But if you stand still enough, you can almost sense the layered past beneath your feet. A few surviving tea houses have been converted into restaurants or homes. A handful of aged photographs hang in museums nearby, black and white glimpses of elaborate hair and steady gazes. The faces in those photos seem to know something we don't. A secret about time, perhaps. Or about beauty's strange endurance. At night, When Tokyo's lights shimmer and reflect on wet pavement, the city almost feels like it's dreaming of them. For a brief second, every reflection could be a lantern, every passerby a silhouette from another century. That's the magic of memory. It blurs until the past and present overlap. And in that overlap, the courtesans live on, not as ghosts, but as gestures. Their legacy today. In modern Japan, the Oiran spirit is celebrated not for what she did, but for how she did it. Her world was full of rules, yet she found ways to express individuality within them. Her art was bound by duty, yet she infused it with personal emotion. That balance, between control and authenticity, remains one of Japan's quietest strengths. You can see it in tea masters who spend years perfecting the angle of a pour, in calligraphers who practice the same brushstroke thousands of times, in designers who strip away noise to find simplicity, in the way even casual acts, like offering a gift or arranging flowers, are infused with respect for form. All of that began, in some way, with the belief that beauty mattered, that beauty could elevate the ordinary. And that belief came alive in the courtesans' world long before it became national identity. The last curtain. So here we are, at the edge of the story. The lanterns have dimmed, the shamisen has stopped. The courtesans are gone, but their performance continues, replayed every time someone pauses before speaking, or admires the way moonlight touches porcelain, or ties an obi with deliberate care. History doesn't end with silence. It ends with a whisper that fades into daily life. And maybe that's what the courtesans wanted all along. Not immortality, but resonance. To be remembered not as scandal or myth, but as part of how a nation learned to see. So, as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine that soft rhythm again, the sound of footsteps on wooden floors, the brush of silk against silk, the echo of laughter carried by the night air. Imagine a woman turning her head slightly, smiling with eyes that know the world's secrets, and disappearing into the mist. That's where we'll leave her. Not gone, not forgotten, just beautifully suspended between time and memory. Good night. Sleep softly. And remember, beauty, when done with grace, never really disappears.